The morning Rose Talmadge found 3 armed men tearing down her fence posts. She did not run back to the house to hide behind locked shutters the way they expected her to. She had buried her husband 11 months ago in the hard red earth of the Texas panhandle, had kept 40 head of cattle alive through a brutal winter without any help from the town of Harlan's Creek, and had learned to fire a Winchester rifle with a steadiness that would make most men reconsider their manners. She was not a woman who hid. She was 29 years old, sun-browned and sharp-eyed, and she had every legal paper in the county clerk's office to prove that the southwestern corner of the Talmadge land stretched exactly where her fence posts had been standing since her late husband James had hammered them into the ground with his own 2 hands 4 years prior. So when she came around the bend of the Cottonwood Grove on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1882 and saw Hector Crane and 2 of his hired hands hauling up fence posts from the ground and tossing them into a pile like so much scrap wood, she did not hesitate. She walked straight toward them with her hands at her sides and her dark hair blowing loose around her face, and she told them to stop what they were doing. Hector Crane was a stocky man with a gray mustache that he was inordinately proud of. He had been trying to acquire the Talmadge land since before James died, had made 2 offers that Rose had refused flatly, and had apparently decided that a widow without a man standing beside her was not much of an obstacle. He looked at her coming down the slope, and he smiled the way men smile when they think they already know how a thing is going to go. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said, and his 2 hands stopped their pulling but did not move away from the posts. "We are just correcting an error. Your fence was over the line by about 40 yards. My surveyor confirmed it." "Your surveyor," Rose said, stopping about 10 feet from him with her arms crossed over her chest, "was hired by you, which means his measurements are worth exactly as much as I trust you, which is not at all." Crane's smile did not waver. He was flanked on his right by a man named Doyle, who was younger and meaner, with small eyes and a revolver on each hip. On his left stood a man called Garrett, older, slower, but wide across the shoulders and fond of cruelty, the way some men are fond of tobacco. "The Harlan's Creek Land Office agrees with my surveyor," Crane said. "I have a document." "I have a document too," Rose said. "Mine was filed first, and it was filed by a man named Franklin Burrows who has been the county surveyor for 14 years and who does not owe you anything." "Franklin Burrows is retired," Crane said pleasantly. "And the new office has reviewed the matter." Rose looked at the posts already pulled from the ground and lying in a heap. Her jaw was tight. The cattle needed that fence because the lower pasture opened to the creek, and without that corner section, the herd would wander onto Crane's land, and he could claim them as strays, which was almost certainly the point. She knew that. She could read the architecture of his greed as clearly as she could read the brand on a calf. "You put those posts back," she said quietly, and her voice was steady and clear in the spring air, "or I will ride to Harlan's Creek today and file a complaint with the marshal, and then I will write to the district court, and I will keep writing until every document you have falsified is sitting in front of a judge." Crane took a step toward her. Doyle and Garrett moved with him, a practiced sort of pressure, 3 large men closing the distance between themselves and a woman standing alone in a field. "Mrs. Talmadge," Crane said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous, "you are a woman alone on a stretch of land that is too big for you to manage. Now James was a fine man, God rest him, and I am offering you a fair price for this property so that you can go live somewhere comfortable. This unpleasantness does not have to continue." "It continues," Rose said, not moving back a single inch, "for as long as you keep standing on my land pulling up my fence." Doyle laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. Garrett cracked his knuckles. Crane reached into his coat, and Rose thought for a cold, sharp moment that he was going for a weapon, but he pulled out a folded paper and held it toward her. "This is the corrected deed map," he said, "signed by the land office." "I do not accept it," Rose said. And that was where the situation had settled itself, tight and ugly like a knot pulled too hard, 3 armed men on one side and one unyielding woman on the other, and the Texas morning warm around them and the cattle lowing somewhere in the lower pasture, and nobody giving an inch. It was exactly then that a sound came from the stand of post oak trees that lined the eastern edge of the pasture. A deliberate, unhurried sound, a throat being cleared, every head turned. A man stepped out of the tree line. He was tall, probably 6'2", lean but broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from hard physical work rather than any particular effort toward it. He wore a worn canvas duster the color of old leaves, dark trousers, and boots that had seen 1,000 miles of Texas trail. His hat was pushed back on his head in a casual way that was somehow not casual at all. He had dark eyes beneath the brim, sharp and calm, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 or 5 days. He was not old, perhaps 32 or 33, and there was nothing threatening in his posture except for the fact that nothing about him was uncertain. He had no gun drawn. He had both hands loose at his sides. He walked toward the group at an easy pace, and when he got within speaking distance, he stopped and looked at the scene with the measured interest of a man reading a posted notice. "Morning," he said, addressing no one in particular, and then his eyes moved to Crane's group with a quality that was not a challenge, but was somehow more unsettling than one would have been. "This is private property," Crane said, and his voice had an edge to it now that had not been there a moment before. "I know it," the man said. "It belongs to Mrs. Talmadge here." He glanced at Rose, and there was something in that glance, a quick appraisal followed by something steadier, that made her breath catch for just a moment before her attention snapped back to Crane. "My name is Alfred Brooks. I am a licensed land surveyor out of Austin, Texas, and I happen to have been contracted by the district court to do a review of land disputes in this county." He reached into the interior pocket of his duster and drew out a folded envelope with a wax seal. "I have my credentials here if anyone would like to examine them." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Crane stared at him. Doyle's hand twitched near his right revolver. Garrett went very still. "I don't know anything about a district court review," Crane said. "That is the way reviews work generally," Alfred Brooks said pleasantly. "They tend not to announce themselves to the parties under investigation." He glanced at the pulled fence posts, the heap of cedar and iron on the ground, and his expression did not change. "I would recommend, Mr. Crane, that you and your men leave this property immediately, and that those posts be returned to their positions within the next 24 hours. The original survey by Franklin Burroughs is legally binding until a federal review has been completed, and that review is now underway." He paused. "Anything that happens to this fence line in the interim will be documented." Crane looked at the envelope in Alfred's hand. He looked at the way Alfred stood. He looked at Doyle and Garrett and must have calculated something in the arithmetic of the situation, because after a long moment he tucked his fraudulent paper back into his coat. "You will finish this through proper channels," he said to Rose, with a look that was meant to be threatening and almost was. "That is exactly what I intend," Rose said. Crane turned and walked away, and Doyle and Garrett followed him, Doyle casting one backward look that was pure malice. The 3 of them disappeared over the rise toward the Crane property, and the sound of their horses eventually faded into the distance. Rose stood in the spring morning and breathed. Then she turned to look at the man named Alfred Brooks. He was already examining one of the pulled fence posts with a practical eye, turning it in his hands to check whether the base was split. "This one can go back in," he said. "The wood is sound." "Who are you?" Rose said. He looked up. Up close his eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the shade of his hat brim, and they held a steadiness that she found herself noticing with an irritation she could not quite explain. "I told you," he said. "Alfred Brooks, licensed surveyor. You told Crane you were contracted by the district court." "I am," he said. "I do contract work for them. I was sent out to look into the land disputes in this county. Crane has been at it for 2 years. He has pressured 4 families off their land using fraudulent surveys." Rose was quiet for a moment. 4 families, she said. Yes. He set the post down and looked at her directly. You were the 5th. The morning was warm around them, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a mockingbird was doing its bright, unruly business. Rose looked at Alfred Brooks and felt a complicated mixture of relief and wariness, and something else that she did not examine closely. Are you going to stop him? She asked. I am going to document it, he said. The stopping is the marshal's business, but documentation is the foundation of everything else. He pulled a small leather notebook from his coat pocket. I will need to walk your fence line and verify the original Burroughs survey. If you are agreeable. She considered him. He had not once spoken to her in the way Crane had, that particular brand of polite dismissal disguised as concern. He had spoken to her the way he had spoken to Crane, which was to say as though she was simply a person present in the situation. When? She said. Now, if you have the time. She looked at the heap of fence posts on the ground and then back at him. I have the time, she said. His name was Alfred Brooks, and she learned the shape of it over the course of that first morning the way you learn any new territory, slowly and with attention to detail. He had been born in 1850 in the hill country outside of San Antonio, the second son of a ranching family that had lost most of its land in the chaos following the war. He had taught himself surveying out of a textbook and 2 years of apprenticeship under an old German man named Wolf Fischer, and he had worked for the district court for the past 6 years, traveling from county to county in the way that certain men do, carrying everything they own in a pair of saddlebags and a bedroll. He was not a talkative man, but he was not a silent one either. He talked when there was something worth saying, and he was quiet when there was not. And Rose found that after 11 months of other people talking at her about grief and practicality, and whether she had considered selling the property, the quality of his quiet was a relief. They walked the fence line together through the morning, Alfred with his transit and chain, Rose with the original survey papers that she had been keeping in the iron box under her bed since James died. The Talmadge land was 320 acres of good Texas grassland, with a creek that ran reliable through all but the driest summers, and a lower pasture that James had declared the best grazing ground in the panhandle the first time he saw it. Rose had agreed with him, and she agreed with the memory of him still. Alfred was meticulous. He set up his transit at each corner marker, read the angles, wrote the numbers in his notebook in a small, careful hand, compared them to the Burroughs survey. He did not rush, and he did not perform the work for her benefit. He simply did it. The Burroughs survey is accurate, he said when they had completed the southern boundary and were walking back along the creek bank. Your fence was exactly where it should be. Crane's man falsified the measurements by 43 yards. I knew that, Rose said. I know you did, Alfred said without any particular emphasis, as though it was simply a fact. She looked at him sidelong. How did you know I would need help today? I did not, he said. I was going to come introduce myself and explain the district court review. I saw the situation when I came through the trees and decided the introduction could wait. You have been watching my property, he glanced at her. I've been surveying the boundary between your property and Crane's, yes. I set up camp at the East Tree line yesterday evening. I was going to knock on your door this morning, but Crane got there first. She thought about that. A man she had never met, camped in the trees along her property line, doing legitimate work on her behalf. She thought about what that would have looked like to her a year ago, before James died, before loneliness had become a texture she moved through every day. It would have seemed strange. Now it seemed like precisely the kind of thing that happened in a life that had become unpredictable. You should come up to the house, she said. I will make coffee. He looked mildly surprised, as though he had not expected the invitation, and something about that surprised expression made her like him a little better. I would appreciate that, he said. The Talmadge house was a good solid structure, built of limestone quarried from the eastern edge of the property, with a covered porch running along the front and a kitchen that James had built larger than strictly necessary because Rose loved to cook, and he had known that from the first week of their marriage. She had kept it up since his death with the same stubbornness she kept up everything else. The floors were swept, the windows were clean, and there was a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen table that she had picked along the creek 3 days ago. Alfred Brooks sat at that kitchen table with his hat in his hands and drank the coffee she poured him, and did not make a single comment about the house or the circumstances or her situation that contained any form of pity. And Rose decided somewhere around the second cup that she was going to trust him, provisionally, in the way that a careful woman trusts someone she has known for only half a day. She told him about Crane's 2 previous offers for the land. She told him about the way the town had grown cooler toward her after James died, the subtle social pressures that were meant to encourage her towards selling and moving on. She told him about the petition Crane had apparently circulated suggesting that the Talmadge land was mismanaged, and Alfred listened to all of it with the kind of attention that takes things in without immediately trying to fix them. "He has done this before," Alfred said when she finished. "The petition is his usual method. He creates the appearance of community concern and then uses it to pressure the land office. And the land office listens to him." Alfred was quiet for a moment. "The land office in this county has a clerk named Weston who received a significant loan from Crane 2 years ago," he said. "Whether that loan created any obligation is part of what the district court is investigating." Rose looked at him. "That is corruption." "Yes," he said simply. "Is anyone going to do anything about it?" "That depends on the documentation," he said, "which is what I am here to build." She refilled his cup without asking because it was empty and asking seemed unnecessary. He watched her do it with an expression she could not quite read, something quiet and attentive, and then he looked down at his coffee. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said, "I want to be honest with you. I can document everything and the documentation is solid, but legal processes in this territory move slowly. It may be weeks before the district court acts. In that time, Crane may try to move more aggressively." "I am aware," she said. "Do you have any people who could help you? Family, neighbors?" She thought about that. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Walter Prout who had made it gently clear that he did not want to get involved in disputes that were none of his business. Her family was in Missouri, 3 days' ride on the train, and she had not asked them for anything because she was not willing to be the kind of woman who cannot manage her own affairs. She had James's cousin Henry who came through twice a year, but he was in New Mexico currently. "I manage on my own," she said. Alfred looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not pity exactly but was something like recognition, as though he understood something about that sentence that went beyond its literal meaning. "I am going to be camped at the East Tree line for at least another week," he said, "until the survey is complete. If anything happens on the fence line or on the property, I would like to know." "You are offering to help," she said. "I am offering to do my job correctly," he said, "which in this case happens to also be helpful." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Outside the kitchen window the morning had grown fully bright, and the cattle were moving in the lower pasture, and the whole of the land that James had loved and that she had held onto by the force of her own determination stretched out green and sunlit under the Texas sky. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." "Alfred," he said. She considered the familiarity of that for a moment. "Alfred," she said. He smiled briefly, and it changed his face in a way she noticed and filed away without commenting on. The week that followed was one of the stranger weeks of Rose Talmadge's adult life, which was saying something given the year she had just come through. Alfred Brooks set up a proper camp at the East Tree line, a canvas tent and a fire ring and a picket line for his horse, a big gray gelding he called Pepper that Rose's cattle regarded with mild suspicion. He worked his way systematically around the property, documenting everything, and most mornings he would come up to the house with his notebook, and they would sit on the porch while she drank her coffee, and he showed her what he had found. He was thorough in a way she respected. He found 3 other places where Crane's men had attempted to move markers, subtle enough that she would not have noticed without the original survey documents. He photographed the evidence with a camera he had in his pack, a small, clever device that Rose had never seen up close before, and explained that photographic evidence was increasingly accepted by the district courts. "When did that start?" she asked. "In the late 70s, mainly," he said. "The courts have been slow to accept it, but they are coming around." She liked talking to him. That was the simple, uncomfortable truth of it. She liked the way he explained things without making her feel as though she should already know them, liked the way he asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. She had forgotten, in the 11 months since James died, what it felt like to have someone in her life who was simply interested in what she thought. James had been that. Her marriage to James had not been without difficulty. They had argued with some passion about various things, but he had always wanted to know her opinion on matters and had never made her feel that the wanting was a courtesy. She had not expected to feel that with a stranger in the course of a week. She did not quite know what to do with it. On the third day, she brought lunch down to him while he was working along the southern boundary, because it seemed like the practical thing to do, and she was making lunch anyway. He looked up from his transit to find her coming across the field with a cloth-covered basket, and his expression did something complicated for a moment before settling into gratitude. They sat on the dry grass in the shade of a mesquite tree and ate cold biscuits and sliced beef and dried apricots, and Alfred told her about a land dispute he had worked in Comanche County the previous year, where a rancher had tried to claim 2,000 acres belonging to a Mexican family by simply filing a fraudulent deed ahead of the legitimate one. "What happened?" Rose asked. "The family got their land back," he said. "It took 8 months and a trip to Austin, but they got it back." 8 months, she said. "Yes." She looked out across the pasture. 8 months is a long time to be uncertain. "It is," he said, and there was a weight in the agreement as though he understood something about uncertainty from the inside. She looked at him. "Have you always done this work? The surveying since I was 22. Do you like it?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything. "I like that it is clear," he said. "The numbers are either right or they are wrong. The boundary is either here or it is there. In a time and place that has a great deal of ambiguity about things that ought to be settled, I find that clarity satisfying." "That sounds like a very solitary life," she said, and then was not sure why she had said it, because it was more personal than she had intended to be. He looked at her without any defensiveness. "It is," he said. She did not say anything else about it, and neither did he, but the words sat between them on the dry Texas grass with a sort of weight that she was aware of for the rest of the afternoon. On the fourth day, Crane's man Doyle rode along the fence line at a distance, looking. Alfred watched him from across the pasture and made a note in his book. Rose watched from the porch with her rifle across her lap, and Doyle eventually rode away without stopping. That evening Alfred came up to the house later than usual. The sun was already going orange and low, painting the limestone walls of the house in shades of copper, and Rose was on the porch shelling beans into a wooden bowl when she heard his boots on the steps. "Doyle was marking the south fence," he said without preamble. "He was noting where the existing posts are. I think Crane intends to try again." Rose set down the bowl. "At night, possibly." She looked at the darkening sky. "Can you sleep on the porch tonight?" she said, and then felt the oddity of the request the moment it was out of her mouth. "I have a bedroll I can bring out." "I do not mean to impose on your camp. It is just that if Crane sends men tonight—" "Of course," Alfred said, and his voice was easy about it, not making anything of the impropriety that a stricter social accounting might have found there. "I will bring Pepper up to your barn if that is all right. Better than leaving him at the tree line." "Yes," she said. "Of course." He brought the horse up and stabled it with her own 2 horses, and Rose brought out the bedroll from the spare room and laid it on the far end of the porch. She made supper for 2 without commenting on the fact that she was doing it, and Alfred ate at the kitchen table again, and they talked about whether the creek had shown signs of lowering, which it had not, and whether the lower pasture grass would hold through May, which she thought it would. After supper, she washed the plates and he sat on the porch steps and smoked a short pipe that smelled of something pleasant and faintly sweet, and the night came on quiet and full of stars. Rose stood at the screen door for a moment, watching the dark fields, watching the line of trees against the sky. "Alfred," she said quietly. "I am here," he said, which was exactly right, exactly what she needed to hear, and she went inside and lay down on her bed and slept better than she had in months. Nothing happened that night, or the night after. Crane was biding his time, probably, waiting to see what Alfred's presence meant. On the 6th day, Alfred rode into Harlan's Creek to send a telegraph to Austin with his initial findings, and Rose stayed on the property and fixed a section of the roof on the chicken house that had been giving her trouble and told herself she was not listening for his horse to come back. He came back in the late afternoon with a response from Austin and 2 letters that had come to the post office addressed to her, and a small jar of blackberry preserves from the general store that she had not asked for and that he set on the kitchen table without comment. She looked at the jar. She looked at him. They were on sale, he said, which was clearly not the real reason, and they both knew it. She picked up the jar. "Thank you," she said. "The district court is sending a marshal next week," he said, getting back to business with a speed that she found charming. 2, actually. They are going to serve Crane with an injunction prohibiting any further encroachment on neighboring properties pending the full investigation. "Next week," she said. "Tuesday or Wednesday," they said. She set the preserves down and opened one of the letters, which was from James's cousin Henry in New Mexico, checking in and offering to come if she needed him. She read it and felt the warmth of it and set it aside. "You saved my fence," she said. Alfred looked up from the map he had spread on the table. "The district court saved your fence," he said. "I just measured things." "You stepped out of those trees at the exact right moment," she said. "And you talked to Crane in a way that worked." "He was calculating the risk," Alfred said. "He did not know how much I knew. That uncertainty was enough." "Still," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the map between them and the afternoon light coming through the window, and something passed between them that was not yet anything with a name but had a definite presence, like weather moving in from the horizon. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said. "Rose," she said. He paused, a small pause, deliberate. "Rose," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and careful, like a man lifting something he was not sure of the weight of. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at the map. "Tell me what this shows," she said, because that was the safer thing, the thing with less at stake, and she was not yet ready for what was at stake. He told her. She listened, and the afternoon moved around them like water. On the 7th day something happened that neither of them had accounted for. Rose was coming back from the lower pasture where she had been checking on a calf that had been looking poorly when she found Garrett, Crane's man, standing beside the barn. He was alone. He did not have his hand on his gun. Rose stopped. Her hand went to the rifle she carried. "I'm not here for trouble," Garrett said, and his voice had a different quality than it had on the morning of the fence dispute. Older, tired. "Then what are you here for?" Rose said. He looked past her toward the fields. "Crane is going to try tonight," he said. "Not just the fence. He is going to start a fire on the south end, make it look like it got away from some travelers." Rose stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I have a sister in Eastland County who lost her place to a man just like Crane," he said. "Took me a while to see it for what it was." He looked at her directly, and his face was not comfortable with what it was doing, but it was doing it. "I am done with Crane after this. I am riding out tonight, but I wanted you to know." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Rose stood still until he was gone. Then she turned and walked fast back to the house. Alfred was on the porch with his notebook when she came up the steps at a clip. He read her face and was on his feet before she said a word. "Tonight," she said. "The south field. Crane is going to burn it." Alfred moved quickly and without drama. He brought Pepper out of the barn and saddled him. Rose saddled her own horse. They rode into Harlan's Creek together as the sun dropped and the sky went the color of old coals. and Alfred went directly to the marshal's office while Rose tied her horse at the rail outside. The marshal of Harlan's Creek was a man named Ed Caswell, broad and reliable, who had known James Talmadge and had done nothing particularly useful about Crane's activities thus far, a fact that Rose was aware of and that Alfred apparently also knew, because he did not rely on Caswell's personal initiative. He laid the district court credentials on Caswell's desk and the telegraph message from Austin and the preliminary survey documentation, and then he told Caswell about the information from Garrett. Caswell was quiet for a while. Then he put on his hat. "I will get 2 deputies," he said. They rode back to the Talmadge property in time. Crane's men came in the dark, 2 of them, with a lantern and a can of coal oil, and Marshal Caswell and his deputies were waiting in the south field when they arrived. There was no shooting. There was some shouting, and then there were handcuffs, and then there was Crane himself riding up to see what had gone wrong and finding Caswell with a warrant for his arrest signed by the district court. Rose stood at the edge of the field and watched. Alfred stood beside her. "Is it over?" she asked. "The fire part is over," he said. "The legal part will take time, but they have him now on attempted destruction of property, and the survey fraud documentation will come into the district court within the month. He will not be doing this again," she breathed out slowly. "4 families he drove off," she said. "Yes. Can they get their land back?" Alfred looked at her. "I am going to work on that," he said. "After this." She looked at him, this careful, steady man who had stepped out of the trees at exactly the right moment and had stayed when staying was useful, and had managed to be present without making himself intrusive, and she felt something shift inside her chest like ground settling after rain. "You are going to move on to another county when this is done," she said. It was not quite a question. He was quiet for a moment. "That is generally what I do," he said. "Is that what you want to do?" she said. Another pause longer. The night was warm and the stars were very bright, and somewhere across the property Caswell was talking to Crane in a voice too low to hear. "No," Alfred said, and the word came out with a simplicity that had nothing cautious about it. She looked at him in the starlight. He looked back at her, and for the first time since she had met him, the careful quality of his face was not in evidence. He looked like a man who had run out of the ability to be careful about something. "I do not know what to do about that yet," he said. "Neither do I," she said, "but I think we should probably figure it out." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, brief and warm, and then they stood there in the south field under the enormous Texas sky with Crane being led away in the dark, and the land around them was solid and real and still hers, and everything felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it might be all right. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Rose found difficult to describe even to herself. Alfred remained on the property through the completion of his survey work, which he extended somewhat more thoroughly than was strictly required by the district court. She did not comment on this. He moved his camp from the tree line to the barn, because the nights had turned cooler and there was a perfectly good empty stall, and Rose told herself this was simply practical and did not interrogate the warmth she felt knowing someone was sleeping in the barn when she went to bed. They settled into something that was neither entirely professional nor entirely personal, but existed in the interesting space between those 2 categories. He helped with the fence repair on the south line, not because she needed help, but because he was there and the posts were heavy, and there was no logical reason to refuse it. She cooked supper most evenings and they ate together on the porch or at the kitchen table, and the conversations they had ranged from the practical to the philosophical in a way that Rose found deeply satisfying. He told her about the land disputes he had seen across the territory, the patterns of who was displaced and how. Mexican families, whose land grants dated back decades before Texas statehood, often found their paper rights ignored entirely. Former enslaved people who had acquired small parcels in the years after the war found themselves pressured off by exactly the kinds of fraudulent processes Crane had used. The law was supposed to protect everyone equally, and it did not, and Alfred said this plainly and without performance, as though it was simply a fact that needed to be acknowledged before anything useful could be done about it. "Is that why you do the work?" Rose asked one evening. They were on the porch and the moon was up, nearly full, and the land was silver and dark under it. "Partly," he said. "When you can give someone their land back or prove that it was stolen, it is concrete, a line on a map. A number, you can hold it in your hand." He was quiet for a moment. "My father lost our ranch after the war. There was nothing fraudulent about it, we simply ran out of money, but I watched him lose the thing he had built, and there was nothing to be done about it because it was legal. The injustice of it did not matter. I think I have been trying to do something about injustice that has legal handles on it ever since." Rose thought about that. She thought about James dying in the cold of that brutal January, not of anything dramatic, but of a fever that came on fast and did not stop, and how she had stood at the grave in the hard ground and felt the weight of everything that was going to be required of her, and had chosen to carry it rather than set it down. "We both know something about holding on to things," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we do." Something changed after that night, or perhaps it did not change but simply became more visible, like a landscape that has always been there but which you can only see when the light falls at a certain angle. Alfred began looking for her when she was not in sight. She began listening for his particular footstep on the porch boards. When she handed him something, his hand would linger for a half-second longer than was necessary, and she did not move hers away, and they both pretended not to notice this. She caught herself smiling for no reason while hanging washing on the line. She noticed that the coffee she made in the mornings had been getting stronger without her consciously deciding to make it stronger, because she had noticed he preferred it that way. He brought wildflowers back from the creek bank one afternoon without saying anything about it, and put them in the jar on the kitchen table where the previous ones had dried out, and she stood looking at them for a long time. Henry arrived from New Mexico on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the night of Crane's arrest. He was a good man, Henry Talmadge, open-faced and cheerful, with James's coloring but not his quiet intensity. He arrived by horse in the mid-morning and found Alfred Brooks repairing the gate on the lower pasture, and Rose bringing a pail of water from the well, and he looked between the two of them with an expression of significant interest that he was not entirely successful at concealing. Over supper he interrogated Alfred with the cheerful thoroughness of a man who considers himself a custodian of family interests, asking about his people, his work, his plans, his intentions toward the property and toward the territory generally. Alfred answered everything with good humor. Rose watched this and felt the peculiar sensation of being embarrassed by someone else's behavior on her behalf, which was an emotion she had not experienced in some years. After supper, when Alfred went out to check on the horses, Henry looked at Rose across the kitchen table with bright, interested eyes. "Well," he said. "Do not," she said. "Rose, the man hung wildflowers in your kitchen." "He put flowers in a jar," she said. "It is not a declaration of anything." "It is absolutely a declaration of something," Henry said comfortably, "and you have been smiling since he walked in this morning." "I am always smiling," she said. "You have not been smiling in 11 months," he said, and his voice went gentler on that, the teasing dropping away. "And I am glad to see it. That is all I mean. I am glad." She looked down at the table. "I do not know what it is yet," she said honestly. "You do not have to know," Henry said. "You just have to let it be whatever it is." Henry stayed a week, and his presence did something useful without his intending it, because the social context of a family member created occasions that might not have occurred otherwise. He insisted on an evening in town at the Harlan's Creek restaurant, which meant Rose and Alfred and Henry eating supper at a table with candles on it, and the whole town able to see, and Rose wearing the blue dress she had not worn since a church social the previous fall, and Alfred in his good shirt with his hair combed back, and neither of them able to look directly at each other for the first 10 minutes without something happening on their faces. Henry talked enough for 3 people, and the tension broke gradually, and by the time the food arrived they were themselves again, which was to say two people who had discovered that being in each other's company was the most comfortable thing either of them had experienced in a long time. Walking back to the horses afterward, Henry some yards ahead pretending to look at something in a shop window, Alfred and Rose were briefly alone on the board sidewalk in the lamplight. The evening was warm and soft. "Rose," Alfred said. She turned to look at him. He stopped walking. He stood in the lamplight and she saw him gather himself in the way he did things, deliberately, without hurry, knowing what he was going to do before he did it. "I would like to stay," he said. "Not for the survey, not for the district court. I would like to stay because I would like to know you better if that is something you want." She looked at him for a long moment. The street was quiet around them, a dog somewhere, the sound of a piano from the saloon a block away. "It is something I want," she said. He nodded and the small smile came again, the one that changed his face. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Henry's voice came from ahead. "Are you two coming, or do you need another 5 minutes?" "Coming," Rose called, and caught the laugh that rose in her throat before it could escape, and walked forward into the lamplight. The courtship, if it could be called that, had the quality of two careful people discovering that carefulness was not going to serve them in this particular situation. They had both been alone long enough that the muscles of closeness had grown stiff, and working them back into use required both patience and a willingness to be awkward, which neither of them found easy. Alfred began splitting wood in the mornings, because the woodpile was low and he noticed these things. Rose began asking his opinion on decisions about the ranch, not because she needed the opinion, but because she valued what he said, and she was learning to distinguish between those two things. He taught her the principles of surveying on a Sunday afternoon, drawing a small map of the property in the dirt with a stick, and showing her how the angles and measurements created a picture, and she was quick about it in a way that pleased him visibly. She showed him how she handled the cattle, the particular system of management she had developed over 4 years that was not exactly what anyone had taught her, but that worked, and he watched with the focused attention he gave everything and asked good questions. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and the distance between their chairs narrowed incrementally over the course of 2 weeks, until they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, and neither of them mentioned the reduction of distance. The first time he touched her, it was not romantic in any deliberate sense. She had slipped coming down the porch steps in the wet after a rainstorm, caught herself on the rail but not before turning her ankle, and he had his hand on her arm before she had finished saying that she was fine. He helped her to the step and crouched to look at her ankle with the same practical attention he gave everything. "It is not swollen," he said. "I told you I was fine," she said. "Yes," he said, and he was still crouched in front of her, and he looked up and they were very close and his hand was still on her arm. He did not move it immediately. "Alfred," she said. "Rose," he said, and his voice was low and careful. "You can stand up," she said. "I am not going anywhere." He stood. He did not entirely let go of her arm. He looked at her with the dark, steady eyes, and she looked back at him, and the rain was still dripping from the porch eaves in a quiet, persistent sound. "I am going to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I am not a man who says things before he means them," he said. "So I want you to know that I mean this entirely." He paused. "I have not been in a place that felt like somewhere I wanted to stay in a very long time. This place does. You are the reason for that." She was quiet for a moment, taking that in, feeling the weight and warmth of it. "I am glad you stepped out of those trees," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he raised her hand that he was holding and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was somehow also completely sincere, and she felt it all the way to her spine. "So am I," he said. The letter from the district court arrived in the middle of May, 6 weeks after Alfred had sent his initial findings to Austin. The investigation into Hector Crane had been completed. Crane was being charged with land fraud in 4 separate cases. The deed records had been corrected. The Talmadge fence line, as documented by Alfred's survey, was confirmed as legally binding. The fraudulent survey by Crane's hired man had been struck from the record. Rose read the letter at the kitchen table 3 times. Alfred was there across the table watching her. He had read it first and handed it to her without speaking. She set it down. She put her hands flat on the table. 4 families, she said. Are they going to get their land back? 2 of them, Alfred said. The other 2 sold voluntarily under the pressure, which is harder to reverse legally. But the 2 who were displaced entirely will have their properties returned. It is going to take months of paperwork, but the ruling makes it clear. And Crane, he will be tried. The charges are federal. He will not be managing land in this territory again. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. Then she looked up at Alfred. What about the land office clerk, Weston? Resigned, Alfred said. He has apparently also left the county. She breathed out slowly. Justice, she thought. Not perfect, not complete, not everything that everyone who had been wronged deserved, but real, measurable, documented. The kind with handles on it, as Alfred had once said. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He shook his head slightly. You held the land, he said. That was not nothing. A great many people would have sold under the pressure. I know, she said. I thought about it once. Very briefly, she looked at him steadily. In December, when the winter was bad and there was nobody and the cattle were struggling, I thought maybe it would be easier, just for a moment. What stopped you? He asked. She thought about it honestly. James planted that lower pasture, she said. He walked every inch of it. He dug that creek channel deeper with a hand shovel over 2 summers so it would hold water longer. I thought, if I sell this, nobody will know that. Nobody will know what he built here. I could not do it. Alfred looked at her with an expression that was full and warm and serious. He would know that you kept it, he said quietly. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Yes, she said, I think he would. She stood from the table and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the land, and Alfred let her look at it in peace because he understood the shape of grief well enough not to crowd it. After a moment she turned back. Henry thinks you should stay, she said. Alfred raised an eyebrow mildly. Does he? He wrote me, she said. The letter that came Tuesday. He says you are clearly a sensible and decent man and that I should not let sensible and decent men wander off unnecessarily. She paused. I am paraphrasing. Alfred was quiet for a moment. And what do you think? He said. She walked back to the table. She stood across from him, with the letter about the land case between them on the table and the wildflowers in the jar on the counter, and the morning coming in through the windows in long, warm bars of light. I think, she said, choosing each word carefully, that this land needs a surveyor who knows every inch of it. His expression was very still. And I think, she continued, that I have been alone long enough that being not alone has begun to feel less frightening than being alone. He stood from the table. He was very close. That is not the most romantic thing I have ever heard, he said, and there was amusement under the seriousness. I told you I mean what I say, she said. I am saying I want you to stay, permanently, if you want that. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that was so unlike his usual measured practicality that it nearly undid her entirely. I want that, he said. She kissed him then because she was done being careful, and he kissed her back with a thoroughness that suggested he had also been done being careful for some time but had been waiting for her to decide. The morning was bright around them, and the land was hers, and the man in her kitchen was going to stay, and everything that had been uncertain for 11 months was settling into something that felt like it had roots. There was still a great deal to manage. Life on a working ranch in 1882 did not slow down for personal developments. The cattle still needed tending, the lower pasture still needed rotation, the water levels in the creek needed watching as summer came on. Alfred was methodical about learning the ranch's operation, applying the same careful attention to Rose's system of management that he applied to everything, and she found his questions useful because they made her articulate things she had only ever done by instinct. He had his final report to complete for the district court, which took 2 weeks of concentrated work in the evenings at the kitchen table while Rose read or sewed or occasionally sat across from him and did accounts. and the comfortable domesticity of it was something she felt in her bones without quite saying so. He rode to Harlan's Creek and sent the completed report to Austin, and then stopped at the general store and bought a small thing that he kept in his coat pocket for 4 days before he used it. She was at the creek bank on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on a flat rock and watching the water, something she did when she needed to think, and he came and sat beside her, and for a while they were both simply quiet in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which required no performance and no filling of space. He reached into his coat pocket and set a small ring on the rock between them. It was a simple thing, a silver band with a small turquoise stone, the kind that was made by the Navajo craftsmen who sometimes came through the trading posts in the territory. Not an expensive thing, not an ostentatious thing, a thing that had been chosen because it was exactly right. Rose looked at it on the rock. "I am not good at speeches," Alfred said. "I have tried to write one 3 times and they were all terrible." She pressed her lips together to contain the smile. "But you know what I mean," he said. "You have known what I mean for some time, so I am just going to ask." He paused. "Rose Talmadge, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then looked at him, this man who had stepped out of the trees when she needed someone to step out of the trees, who had measured every inch of her land with a care that was also a kind of love, who drank strong coffee and put wildflowers in jars and kissed her with a thoroughness that she thought about at odd moments of the day. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and she held it up in the afternoon light, and the turquoise caught it blue and warm. And then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat by the creek for a long time while the water went its own good way, and the land spread out around them in the Texas afternoon. They were married in July of 1882 in Harlan's Creek by the local preacher, a small wedding with Henry Talmadge present and the couple's nearest agreeable neighbors, Walter Prout and his wife, who had become considerably more friendly once Crane was out of the picture, and the social mathematics of the county had shifted. Rose wore a dress of ivory lawn cotton that she had made herself, and she put wildflowers in her hair because Alfred had brought them that morning, and she could not think of a better use for them. He stood at the front of the church in his good clothes and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that Henry later described as a man seeing the entire rest of his life arrive at once, which Rose thought was a very good description. The preacher spoke briefly and well, and they said their vows in the clear, direct way of people who meant them. And when Alfred kissed her in front of the gathered company, he did it with a restraint that was nonetheless complete, and there was applause, and Henry wiped his eye with his sleeve and pretended he had not. The reception was on the Talmadge Ranch, the Talmadge and Brooks Ranch as it would henceforth be called, with food that the neighboring women had contributed, and a fiddler from town who played until the stars were fully out. Alfred danced with a stiff sincerity that made Rose laugh, and she taught him the steps of a reel that he was determined to get right, and they danced in the warm July night on the packed earth of the yard until his steps were steady enough to be called dancing. They were very happy that night, and in the days and weeks and months that followed they were also very happy, which is a different thing, a quieter and more sustained thing, built of practical mornings and long evenings and the steady accumulation of a shared life. Alfred took on survey contracts from the district court that allowed him to work primarily in and around Harlan's Creek, a situation he had proposed to his supervisor in Austin, and that the court had agreed to given the quality of his work. He rode out on contracts that kept him away for 2 or 3 days at a time, and Rose managed the ranch in his absence with the same competence she had always had, and when he came back, they settled back into each other with an ease that still surprised her in its warmth. He was a man who noticed things. She would be struggling with some problem on the property, and he would have thought about it in the days he was away, and would bring his thoughts back without preamble, practical and useful. He noticed when she was tired before she said so, and he noticed when she was worried, and he would come and sit with her without requiring her to talk until she was ready. He had not learned these things in the first months of their marriage, but he was learning them, and the learning was something she treasured, the visible effort of a man who had been solitary making himself available. She learned him too. Learned that he had dreams sometimes that left him quiet in the mornings, related to his father's loss of the ranch, and a childhood that had asked too much of a boy too young. Learned that he was genuinely funny when he was comfortable, with a dry, oblique humor that crept up on you. Learned that he loved music though he could not play any instrument, and that he had a habit of reading whenever he could, and that he cried at nothing visible except once when she told him she was expecting a child, and the tears surprised them both. That was in the spring of 1883, 10 months after their marriage. She told him in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, not because Tuesday was significant but because that was when she was certain enough to say it, and he sat very still at the kitchen table for a moment, and then he stood up and held her with a care and a completeness that she felt was its own kind of language. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Tired but well." "You will tell me what you need," he said. "I will tell you what I need," she agreed, and she felt him breathe out slowly, the breath of a man releasing something he had been holding. She had not been sure, going into it, how she felt about the idea of a child. James and she had tried in the 4 years of their marriage, and there had been no child, and she had grieved that quietly and set it aside, and then James had died and the question had become moot. She had not thought much about it in the year since, but when the certainty arrived it arrived with a warmth that was definitive and complete, and she found that she wanted this very much. Alfred was good through the pregnancy in a way that was practical and also tender. He took on no contracts that would keep him away for more than 2 days. He carried anything heavy without being asked. He read about childbirth from a medical text he had ordered from Austin, with a seriousness of purpose that made Rose simultaneously exasperated and deeply moved. And he reported his findings to her in the evenings in the manner of a man presenting survey data, which she found so characteristic of him that she could not do anything but love it. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a clear cold morning with the first hard frost on the ground, and the sun coming up orange and brilliant over the eastern tree line. The midwife from Harlan's Creek attended, a competent woman named Mrs. Delaney, who had delivered half the children in the county, and whose presence Rose had been glad of. Alfred paced the porch for 4 hours, and then the midwife let him in, and he sat beside the bed and held Rose's hand and was very pale but steady throughout. And when the baby came, he made a sound that Rose had never heard from him before, a low wordless sound of something complete. They named him James Alfred Brooks, James for the man who had loved the land and built the creek channel and planted the lower pasture. Alfred because it seemed right for a boy to carry his father's name somewhere in him. He had dark hair like Alfred and Rose's wide brown eyes, and he was from the first day of his life a person with opinions, announcing them loudly and often. Alfred held him the first evening with the careful precision of a man holding something he does not want to measure wrong, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused gravity of the newly arrived, and Alfred said, very quietly, "Hello, James," and there was more in that greeting than Rose could have translated into ordinary language. The ranch prospered in the years after. Alfred's survey work brought in steady income that supplemented the ranch revenue, and Rose expanded the herd carefully, buying good breeding stock from a reliable cattleman in Midland. The lower pasture James Talmadge had hand-dug the creek channel for proved exactly as productive as he had known it would be, and Rose always thought of him when the cattle came in from it fat and healthy. The Crane case concluded in federal court in early 1884. Hector Crane was convicted of land fraud and sentenced to 5 years in the federal penitentiary. The two families who had been entirely displaced from their properties received formal restoration of their deeds, and Alfred was present in the Austin courthouse when the ruling was handed down, having traveled there to testify about his survey findings. He came home with the official verdict document in his pack, and Rose read it at the kitchen table and felt the satisfaction of it in her whole body. 4 families he went after, she said. And 3 of them have their land back, Alfred said. And you never lost yours. Because you stepped out of those trees, she said. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, James Alfred sleeping in the cradle nearby. The property spread out around the limestone house in all directions, solid and documented and legally incontestable. I have been thinking about that morning, Alfred said. I think about it fairly often. So do I, she said. If I had come 5 minutes later, he said. You did not, she said. You came when you came. He looked at her. I nearly did not stop at this property first, he said. I had a route planned. The Crane-Talmadge boundary was actually the second on my list. I changed it that morning for no particular reason. She looked at him across the kitchen table. For no particular reason, she said. For no reason I can account for logically, he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat in the kitchen of the house they shared while the baby slept, and the land rested outside under the spring sun. Then I will choose not to account for it logically, she said. Some things do not need measuring. He smiled, the full version, the one that still changed his face in the way she had noticed on the very first day. You are becoming very unscientific, he said. You are a terrible influence, she said. Henry Talmadge came back through in the autumn of 1884 and declared the ranch looking better than he had ever seen it, and James Alfred to be the finest child in the territory, which Rose acknowledged was partially biased but not entirely. Henry had himself recently married a woman in New Mexico, a rancher's daughter named Clara, and he was voluble and happy about it, and Rose saw in his happiness an echo of her own and was glad for him. The 4 families whose lives Crane had disrupted did not all recover fully. Life was not that tidy. One of the families that had sold under pressure moved to Oklahoma Territory and did not return. The clerk Weston was never prosecuted, only having resigned, which Alfred considered an injustice and said so plainly whenever it came up. These things were true, and they lived alongside the other things, the good things, the restored deeds and the convicted fraudster, and the fence line that stood exactly where Franklin Burroughs had surveyed it. Rose and Alfred's second child arrived in the spring of 1886, a boy again, which made James Alfred imperious with big brotherly authority at the age of 2.5. They named the second one William, for Alfred's father, and he was a calmer child than his brother, placid and observant, with Alfred's habit of watching a situation before acting on it. The house gained a room that Alfred built himself over the summer of 1886, slow and careful work, the limestone quarried from the same eastern edge of the property that had provided the original walls. He was not a natural builder, but he was a determined one, and the room was solid and well-made and had a window that looked east toward the tree line. Rose would stand sometimes at the west-facing kitchen window in the evenings and look out at the land, the lower pasture going gold in the last light, the creek line dark with cottonwoods, the cattle moving in their slow, steady way. She thought about James Talmadge, who had loved this land and built it and died too young with much of it still undone. She thought about the 11 months of alone, which had been the hardest thing she had ever done, harder even than his death because his death had had the mercy of shock and grief, and the aloneness afterward was nothing but long and clear and continuous. She thought about a man stepping out of a tree line and clearing his throat at exactly the right moment. She thought about the turquoise ring on her finger that she had worn every day since July of 1882. Alfred would come in from whatever he had been doing and find her at the window, and he would come and stand beside her and look at the same view, and his hand would find hers the way it always did, without looking, without deliberation, simply and surely, and they would stand together in the kitchen of the house they had built their lives in while the evening light moved over the land that was theirs. "What are you thinking?" he asked once on one of those evenings. She considered it. "I am thinking that James built something good here," she said, and that I am glad I kept it, and that you are the reason I am glad rather than simply proud." He was quiet beside her for a moment. Outside, James Alfred's voice could be heard somewhere in the yard, conducting some argument with a fence post, which he had a habit of doing. "What does that mean?" Alfred asked. "The difference between glad and proud." "Proud is what you feel when you have done something alone," she said. "Glad is what you feel when it meant something to someone else." She looked at him. "I kept this land through a very hard year, and I was proud of that. But I am glad because you are here, and because James Alfred is in the yard arguing with fence posts, and because William is asleep in the house. That is the difference." He looked at her with the dark, steady eyes, and the evening light was warm between them. "I am very glad," he said quietly. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "I know," she said. "So am I in the years that came after Harlan's Creek grew, as Texas towns grew in those years, adding a school and a second church and a proper telegraph office, and eventually a small newspaper that Alfred subscribed to immediately and read with great attention. The territory changed around them, as territories did, and some of the changes were improvements and some were not, and they talked about all of it in the evenings on the porch, which remained their particular territory, the place where conversation happened honestly and without the performance of it. James Alfred started school in the autumn of 1888 at the age of 5, and took to it with the aggressive competence that characterized everything he did, and informed his parents at supper most evenings of various facts they had not previously known. William started 2 years behind him and was quieter about it but no less effective, with a particular gift for numbers that Alfred noticed and encouraged. The ranch continued. Alfred continued his survey work, had built a reputation across 3 counties that meant his schedule was full most months, but he managed it so that he was home more than he was away, and the rhythm of their life was such that his departures and returns were absorbed into the larger pattern without disruption. A 3rd child came in 1890, a daughter they named Elizabeth, which James Alfred declared an interesting development, and William accepted with equanimity. She had Rose's dark hair and Alfred's steadiness, and from the first month demonstrated a personality that combined both of her parents' most characteristic qualities, which is to say she was observant and unhurried and absolutely unwilling to be moved from a position she had decided on. "She is entirely you," Alfred said one evening, watching Elizabeth refuse to be put down to sleep by means of sheer sustained willpower. "She is entirely both of us," Rose said, which was true. The fence line that had started everything stood through all the years unchanged. Alfred maintained it with the same care he gave the survey markers, checking it each spring, replacing posts that had rotted, tightening wire that had gone slack. It was just a fence. It was also the most precisely documented fence in the county, with 4 separate official survey confirmations in the county records, which Alfred had ensured in a way that was methodical enough to be called obsessive if you were not the person whose cattle depended on it. Rose understood it. The fence line was where he had stepped out of the trees. The fence line was where everything had started. She did not say this to him because he already knew it, and some things did not need to be said to be true. There was a morning in the spring of 1892 when she went out early, before the children were up, and walked down to the south fence line the way she sometimes did. The morning was cool and clear, the sky just going from dark to blue-gray, with the first birds starting in the cottonwoods. She stood at the fence and looked at the land on both sides of it, her land on the north and the old Crane property on the south, which had been purchased by a family named Alcott after the Crane proceedings and was now a productive horse farm. She thought about that morning 10 years ago. The 3 men, the pulled posts, the silence of the pasture, and then the sound of a throat being cleared. The man who stepped out of the trees. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Alfred was coming down the slope with his coat open and his hat on and 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand. He had seen her go out the window and had followed, as he sometimes did, without fanfare. He handed her a cup. "You come down here some mornings," he said. "I do," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the fence line in the early light. "Thinking about Crane. Thinking about everything," she said. That morning, all of it, she looked at him. "I was so angry that morning, and so alone, even though I would not have admitted it." "You were not particularly frightened," he said, and there was a warmth in this observation, a respect. "I was somewhat frightened," she said honestly. 3 armed men and no one nearby. I was frightened and angry in equal measure. "And then someone cleared his throat," he said, with the dry gentleness that was one of her favorite things about him. "And then someone cleared his throat," she agreed. The sun was beginning to lift over the eastern tree line, the very tree line he had stepped out of, and the light came in long, warm bars across the pasture. She could hear faintly the sound of James Alfred moving around in the house, because he was always awake early, always the first one up, always conducting some urgent piece of business with the morning. Alfred put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence line with their coffee in the spring morning while the light grew around them, and the land that they had built their life on stretched out in every direction, documented and certain in theirs. "I am going to survey the lower pasture again this week," he said. The east corner marker looked like it had shifted in the winter. "Of course you are," she said. "Someone has to keep the numbers right," he said. "Someone does," she agreed. She put her head briefly against his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and the morning continued around them in the warm and certain way of mornings that have found their proper shape. From the house came the distinct sound of William telling Elizabeth that she could not have the biscuit he was eating, and Elizabeth's equally distinct response, which suggested that she had a different understanding of the situation and intended to pursue it. James Alfred's voice came in a moment later, adjudicating with the authority of eldest siblings everywhere. Alfred sighed slightly, the sigh of a man who loves his children and also values his mornings. "We should go in," Rose said. "We should," he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. The cottonwoods were bright with new leaves, and the cattle were beginning to move in the lower pasture, and the fence line stood exactly where it was supposed to stand, where it had always been supposed to stand, measured and recorded and permanent as any line on earth can be. She took his hand. He took hers. They turned and walked back up the slope toward the house, toward the sounds of their children and the smell of the coffee they had left on the stove and the long, ordinary, extraordinary day ahead. And the land was bright behind them, and the morning was good, and everything they had built together was still standing. Some things, Rose thought, do not need measuring to be known, but it helps to have a man around who knows how to measure them anyway. The turquoise ring caught the light as she walked, blue as a Texas sky, solid as the ground beneath her feet, and Alfred's hand was warm in hers, and the whole of it, the loss and the holding on and the mourning in the field and the throat, cleared at exactly the right moment, and the 10 years of good mornings and difficult mornings and everything in between, the whole of it was exactly right, exactly as it should be, exactly where it belonged.